Once to every man and nation comes a moment to decide. In the strife of truth and falsehood, for the good or evil side. That song's an old anti-war protest song, but it's much older than the protest songs you probably know. It's much older than the 60s, the Vietnam War, the hippies, and flower power. This anti-war protest song comes from way back in the 1840s. And this is the story of where that song came from. It's a story related to this land that we're standing on right here. It's a story of war, bloodshed, and tragedy, and ghosts. And it's the story of one haunted battlefield just north of here. A story of restless spirits in our midst. Some great cause, God's new Messiah offers each the bloom or blight. And that choice goes on forever twixt the darkness and the light. The song was written during the U.S. invasion of Mexico, and one of the bloodiest battles of that war in 1846 happened just north of here in San Pascual. San Pascual was a village outside of what's now Escondido, and it's near the Wild Animal Park, actually. There's a visitor center. You can go there. It's a state park now. You can go visit, and they say it's haunted. People who spend enough time out there, they're almost guaranteed to see or hear something. People out there, sometimes they hear these spectral screams of people who are not there anymore. They say that they see figures riding on horseback around the valley, restless spirits in our midst. Garrison Keillor, he once said that all ghost stories are about people from whom life was wrenched suddenly and unjustly, restless spirits in our midst. I went out there a few years ago to talk with the people who work at that state park, and I asked them about the ghost stories. I spoke with one young woman. She said she took a photograph of the valley where that fighting happened, where all the blood was shed, and she was just taking a picture of the sunset, but when she got her film developed later, she looked and saw the figure of a man standing there holding like an 11-foot tall lance next to him. I talked to a young man who worked out there. He told me he used to get to work early because he likes to read. So he would get there when it was still misty in the early morning, and he'd park his car and he would just sit there in that peaceful landscape and he'd read his book. But one morning he was there sitting reading, and then he saw movement on his rear view mirror, and he looked and he saw somebody walking behind his car wearing period clothing from the 1840s. And he didn't think anything of it at first because he thought, well, that's normal. It's one of the reenactors walking around wearing the costume. And then he remembered, but wait, there's no reenactments today or this month or any time in the near future. So he got out of his car and he went out and he looked all around that old rocky landscape. He didn't see anyone. I was out there. I heard these stories, so I went walking around that lonesome rocky landscape myself. I was walking up a hill, and up over the rise of the hill I could hear some people chatting in soft voices. I couldn't even quite tell what language they were speaking, but I just figured it was a family having a picnic till I came to the rise of the hill, and I got up there and nobody was out there. Voices stopped. So I went and I talked to the workers there, and one young lady, she said, well, maybe it was animals you were hearing. Some people, they say they hear screams. I think it's just coyotes, or it might be the wild animals from the safari park just over the fence back there. But I told her it wasn't screams, though. It didn't sound like animals. It was people talking. the voices of people from another time, maybe, restless spirits in our midst. See, this is the place, San Pascual Battlefield. It's the kind of place that holds on to the past. It clings to these memories like a sponge and soaks them up. And there's a significance to that battlefield just north of here that goes beyond the fighting that just took place there on that day on December 6th in 1846. It goes much beyond that. And that's what this song is about. By the light of burning martyrs, Christ, thy bleeding feet we track, toiling up new Calvary's ever, with the cross that turns not back. See, while that war was going on here in California, back east in the United States, a lot of people were protesting that war. Americans of conscience were standing up and they were protesting that war. They said it was a shameless land grab. They said it was a violent, aggressive, jingoistic invasion of a sovereign nation with the flimsiest of justifications behind it. Like so many wars, they said it was rich man's war, poor man's fight. It's the poor men who do all the fighting in any war, anywhere. And in this war, as in many wars, it erupted into a lot of other proxy wars. Right here in California, a lot of those proxy wars happened between different groups of native Californian people, where Mexico and the U.S. pressured different groups of native people to fight each other, both of them fighting for a cause that couldn't have been more foreign to them, fighting for a victory of whether one side won or the other. Both these groups didn't have a lot to win from it. And so people were protesting this war. They were speaking up against it. Intellectuals. There was a young author that you might have heard of at some point. Samuel Clemens was his name. He was speaking out against that war. You might know him as Mark Twain. There was a young lawyer you might have heard of at some point named Abraham Lincoln. He was one of the protesters against that war too. And these people were looking for an anthem to speak out against this war. See, they were against it because it was the aggressive invasion of a sovereign nation. They couldn't see how anyone could justify that. But there was a bigger reason why they protested it too. And that was because of slavery. Because during this war, some of the biggest proponents of this invasion were politicians who were in favor of slavery. They wanted to expand that evil institution into broader territories. And the abolitionists in the United States were afraid of that happening, and their fears were justified. In fact, once Texas was admitted into the Union as a slaveholding state. And so they wrote this song. A man, I wrote his name now because I always forget it, James Russell Lowell, wrote the lyrics to this song, wrote it as a poem at first, and he wrote it as an anthem of abolitionists in the U.S. And if you listen to the lyrics of the song, you hear that it's calling out in no uncertain terms, calling the whole nation to task for that evil and telling people this is a time to stand up against this violence, against this evil and the expansion of the evil of slavery, and you need to choose what side you're on. You cannot remain neutral. And you can hear that in the lyrics of the song. New occasions teach new duties. Time makes ancient good uncouth. They must upward on and over. Who would stand on this side of truth? For a while, it looked like that invasion, it might not succeed after all. When the invading forces came to California, they took some cities, they took Los Angeles, but then under a relative of Governor Pio Pico, Andres Pico led the resistance. And the resistance took a lot of those cities back. In California, south of Santa Barbara, nearly every city and town was taken back by people defending their country. Almost every city except for San Diego actually was taken back. For a while, it looked like the tide might be turning, so people were fighting even harder, and that was when the Battle of San Pascual happened. That was when the forces of General Kearney came marching into, it was just a little village known as San Pascual at the time, and General Kearney was leading his dragoons in there, and the forces under Andrés Pico were waiting, ready for them. So they were sitting there one cold December 6th morning. It was a misty, rainy morning, and the fighting was fierce, and it was bloody, and it was rough. Even people who had never fought in their lives, they knew what they had to lose, so they fought tooth and nail. There was one man, let's call him Enrique. Everyone knew him as a rancher and a farmer, but when he was out there, they gave him a new name. They called him El Lobo, the wolf, because they saw how fiercely he became a different person out on the battlefield. He went in with an 11-foot lance, was attacking the invaders with this lance. And then when his lance broke, he picked up a fallen soldier's sword and he fought with that sword. Then the sword broke in two and he picked up an axe and he fought with that. And it took a whole crowd of the invaders to beat him with their muskets, take him down at last. But everybody remembers El Lobo. Some people say El Lobo, he's still out there in San Pascual, one of those restless spirits in our midst. The battle came and it went, and for a while it wasn't even sure what side had won that battle. People weren't sure, but the invasion continued on. And eventually the invasion was successful. And those folks who had protested against that war back in the United States, they couldn't have felt lower at that moment, fearing that maybe all of these territories, more than half the national territory of Mexico that had been taken over, that might become slave-holding territory. It seemed like everything that they had hoped for had been lost. The chance of ever seeing a world where this evil institution might finally be outlawed, that hope was just gone. But in that context, feeling like everything had been lost, feeling like evil was on the throne right then, they still sung this song. They sang this song with all those religious overtones to it. And you can hear that hope in the song, in the final verse to it. Though the cause of evil prosper, yet 'tis truth alone is strong. Though her portion be the scaffold, and upon the throne be wrong. While all of that was happening, those people continued to sing this song because they remembered those people who had died that day and so many days of that war, those restless spirits in our midst. And they sang that song in hope for a future that might not come in their lifetimes, but some future when those wrongs would be put right, when things would be set right. And those of us who sing protest songs today against oppression and war and violence and injustice, we can have that hope that those folks had back then, even though it might not be something we ever see in our lifetimes. Though the cause of evil prosper, those yet still 'tis truth stands strong. Though though her portion be the scaffold, and upon the throne be wrong, yet that scaffold sways the future, and within the great unknown standeth God from within the shadows, standing watch upon his own, standing watch upon his own. The San Pascual Battlefield. Thank you.